Okay, well, here we go with Ghana. Definitely the most formative period, I would say, in my adult life. A lot of these recollections were, written down around the early 2000s. So, I've added to them since then. Well, here we go. September the 16th, 1975. I remember the date of the flight. Gibson came to Heathrow to see me off. On the flight, which was British Caledonian, I remember, I was so excited and awestruck by the views over the Sahara. We arrived and stayed in Accra for a couple of days of orientation. We went to the British Council place in Accra first. They were officially responsible for us as volunteers. I remember passing the billboards on the road and thinking it was so curious that there were Africans on the billboards, the advertisements. Well, who else would there be? Well, if this wasn't a goat track, I don't know what a goat track is. Anyway, there were advertisements also for Pilsener beer. Ghana and Africa was love at first sight. I almost instantaneously fell in love. In spite of the din of the traffic and the rich smells and the heat, there was something gentle and innocent about the people on the billboards, even, and certainly those on the street, most of whom were walking compared to being in cars back in the UK. There was something light and friendly about the atmosphere. At the British Council, I remember gazing at the greenery around me, the huge leaves of the banana trees. We were orientated by some officials from the Ministry of Education at Winneba Teacher Training College. All I can remember of this was the friendliness of the Ghanaians and how they so much wanted to teach us how to dance. I think I got sick pretty quick, pretty much right away, actually. Serious stomach cramps right from the start. I also remember that my future roommate in the small village of Wa in the upper region of Ghana in the bush, I also remember that he said virtually nothing to me, which irritated me at the time. In retrospect, I think he wanted to make friends with the other volunteers before they departed to all parts of the country. Probably a good move. I also remember meeting Elle for the first time. She was the other volunteer, French Canadian, who would be at WA. She too avoided me like the plague. It wasn't a very auspicious start in some way, as far as my companionship in WA was concerned. I was hopeless with women anyway. At that point, I was painfully shy, and I covered it up with a kind of passive aggressive, almost resentful bluster, which I figured passed for manly in my teens and 20s, and which quite understandably failed to have the desired effect of charming the girls. I never have been able to convince myself, really, that anyone could have been more insecure than I was at the age of 22. Basically, I was terrified of most women, although my head often told me that they were much more nervous than me. Somehow this knowledge did not stop me from quaking in my boots in the presence of many females. Elle was very pretty in a tomboyish way. Prettiness and beauty in a female have always intimidated me. When we reached Wa after a 2-day journey by bus, A and I rolled up at the school. Of course, our bungalow was not ready for us, and we had to clean it on our hands, on knees and knees. The very first night was one to remember. I went to the switch on the wall to put off my light in my bedroom. As I turned round to look at the bed, just so I could make my way to it after putting off the light, I glanced down, and there in my view was, large as life, sure enough, the proverbial African scorpion making its way towards my bed from the wall. I was transfixed with terror. I shouted for A, who was in the next room, but he was equally hopeless and in a panic too, like me. We searched for something to squash it, and I couldn't find anything. I'd hardly unpacked. Eventually, I got a tin, a chocolate tin, a cake tin, which had an elevated bottom. And so I only just managed to successfully squash this scorpion, this intruder. Of course, in reality, we were the intruders, and we were disturbing it. I remember the first staff meeting was at 9 a.m. the following day, and I remember splashing my way through the rain and mud to reach the staff room on time. A very silly thing to do in Africa. All the Ghanaian teachers, quite sensibly, waited until the rain had finished. Only a white man would run through the puddles to be on time. I remember being appointed at that meeting, appointed without any discussion or consultation, head of science in that very first meeting. I was also told that I would be teaching O-level chemistry then, not biology as I'd been promised back in the UK. I hadn't a clue about the chemistry, but I had my old book from Campbell College, Kleins and Williams, and I had 1 week to prepare a course. I started from the beginning with the structure of the atom, which I think I did with all 5 classes, year 1 to year 5. I managed to keep a couple of days ahead of my year 5 O-level class for most of the year, and no one was any the wiser. As it happened, my students did very well, and I learned a very valuable lesson very early in my professional career, namely that I could do just about anything if I was asked politely. The science laboratory was little more than an old room, really, more like a garage, with two long benches in it where the students sat on their stools. There were 3 Bunsen burners, if I remember correctly, which worked. Each was attached to a gas cylinder under the bench. There were no sinks with water, no taps, no running water, just a bucket of water and assorted pieces of glassware buried under the dust and cobwebs, a few test tubes and beakers. Very few chemicals, but there were huge vat-like bottles of concentrated sulfuric acid, sodium, potassium, and even phosphorus. There were 2 memorable lab assistants, both very obliging, but with very modest skills. The students were wonderful. I loved them. They were so friendly and appreciative of the work that I did with them. I remember after about 6 weeks of teaching general science to these students that 2 of them came to my bungalow one day and they said, Master, would you be able to give us extra classes in the evening? I thought about it. Well, I thought, why not? There's not much happening here really in the evenings. Okay, I said. So at 7 o'clock, I turned up, and all 38 of my students were standing there waiting for me to enter the classroom. A few days later, I asked my star student, Adam Zadamu, what he would like to do when he left WA Secondary School. And he said, I would like to go to New York, sir. Okay, I said. And if you can't go to New York, London, sir. I took a deep breath. And if you can't make it to London, Accra, sir. Accra was the capital of Ghana, about 600 miles away from Wa, 2 or 3 days' journey by bus. This brief conversation gave me pause for thought. After about 2 months, I realized that what I was doing actually was helping to depopulate a very poor part of rural Ghana of its most able and intelligent youth. I was helping send them to New York or London or Accra. How relevant was that? How idealistic was that? I did a lot of soul searching and I eventually came to the opinion that I was enjoying the teaching too much and life in general there to resign. So I did not resign in disgust. I remember the names of all the other students in that group. Kwesi Basambi Tongo, Winia Seydou Nabor, Bakaweri BVC. At the time, I thought they were the most wonderful group of young people that I had ever met. I loved the teaching, in spite of the blistering heat and the appalling conditions. Alphonsus Assoma, the head prefect, was the perfect gentleman, and at 24, 2 years older than I was. At the time, I thought these were the most wonderful group of young people I had ever met. I loved the teaching, in spite of the blistering heat. Well, Alphonsus Assoma, yes, the head prefect, he was the perfect gentleman, and at 24, yeah, he was 2 years older than I was. After class, Alphonsus would come up to me and he would walk me to my bungalow on the campus, holding me by the hand. I had a bicycle, which he sometimes borrowed. He used the most quaint form of English. Master, he said, I came to your bungalow and met your absence. The politeness, the respect. It was a boarding school, and on Saturday evenings the students would set up dancing sessions using their wooden xylophones outside and dancing away in the dust to entertain themselves. I was in heaven, transported by the romance of the scene. The staff were from all over Ghana, some young, some older. There was Mr. S., the headmaster, who really seemed to me to be quite efficient. But he wasn't popular with the missionaries, who regarded him as a bit of an ambitious wheeler-dealer. I don't know. The deputy was the benign Mr. Kwankwari. He had a permanent, but seemed to me sometimes forced grin on his face. He was a man of the world, and he knew that I was just a transient young creature who would pass through his life, something I didn't know because I was so full of my own self-importance. He was friendly, like all Ghanaians, but I think he was a little taken aback by the arrogance of the white volunteers, the three of us. We had assembly every morning at 7 o'clock outside around the flagpole, and we would sing the national anthem. I didn't sing, of course, as I thought such things were divisive. Nationalism for me, as a child of the 70s, was a redundant and dangerous concept. I remember Mr. Kwankwari asking me one day, very politely, Mr. Nixon, why don't you sing the anthem? I think he was rather bemused by my attitude. I don't blame him. There were some younger Ghanaian staff from the south and a few older ones with families from the north. There was Mr. I, the agriculture teacher, and another agriculture teacher whose little boy, very sadly, died after drinking kerosene by mistake. There was also Mr. B, the Bible studies teacher, who was the stereotypical, very strict and short-tempered teacher. There was Mr. P, the English teacher, who was very friendly. He orientated the three volunteers when we first came and showed us around. Mr. P was a very polite, engaging young man at that time. Later on, Mr. P became a member of the Ghanaian Parliament and was elected. And eventually he became Speaker of the House of the Parliament, a fact of which I am so proud. Later on, I was to meet Mr. P again when I went back to Ghana in 2014, nearly 40 years after these events. It was such an experience to meet him again. Beautiful experience. And I will certainly talk about it later on in other podcasts. But the person perhaps I got to know best was John Dee, the physics teacher. A charming, small, gentle Ghanaian man from Takoradi. He was the physics teacher. I used to go and chat to him in his house in the evenings because his wife was living in the south in Takoradi on the coast. At Christmas, he invited me to stay with him in Takoradi. I had a great time. On the way back, I took another volunteer called Nick with me to Wa. We got on well together. He was a qualified doctor, wanted to be an administrator and not to do any doctoring. He had a great sense of humor. He stayed with me in Wa for a while. Because of his sense of humor, we got on well, but that was the last I ever saw of Nick. Going back to John again, John Dee was a very gentle fellow. And there is a story about him, which is a little bit of a sad story. He had a dog called Tofa, and she really was a cracker of a bush dog. I grew attached to her, of course. And well, Tofa and my friendship with John came to a tragic end. Now, when I say he had a dog, no, I mean I had a dog called Tofa, not John. Sadly, midway through the second year, John's wife tragically died, giving birth to their first baby in Ghana. The funeral expenses in Ghana are enormous, and poor John didn't have the money to pay for the funeral. So he asked me for some money. I gave him some, just a few dollars. But I think he was embarrassed to ask me for more. So what did he do? Sad as it seems, he arranged for Tofa, my little dog, to be kidnapped and sold to be eaten in the local village. Now, this was just before I left Ghana at the end of my 2 years. So from John's point of view, he must have thought, oh, well, he's going away. What'll happen to the dog? Doesn't matter. Nobody wants it, and it just was convenient for him, and he was desperate for money. However, as it turned out, I only found this out a few days before I left Wa. And it was very embarrassing because John didn't realize that the dog was a pet for me. And pets, had an emotional connection with me as well. So it was a sad thing. And John really couldn't look me in the eye for the last few days when he realized I had found out. And I didn't say anything, of course. It was so sad. So sad.